right, first I'd like to introduce Judith Helfand, the director and producer. The producer, Fenell Doremus. Dr. Murray. And Orrin Williams. So now that they've gotten settled in, and before I take my place, I'd like to hear some of the words that come to mind.
Bullshit.
Ah, okay.
Shameful.
Shameful, bullshit,
Injustice.
injustice,
Reality check.
reality check,
Empathy.
empathy, frustration for me,
Enraged.
enraged,
Systemic.
systemic,
Choices.
choices,
Old American story.
old American story. All of those words give us a certain feeling of rage, as well as to start the conversation. And I think that's something that the filmmakers, as well as the participants, really wanted to do in being part of this film. So, as we start the conversation is not only going to be about our remembering an anniversary for the sake of remembering it or to be reminded of it, but a conversation that will actually move us to talk about what it means to be community and how we can actually put that into action. So first, I'm going to ask you, Judith, I know you said that you did not really have this on your radar initially. The book is something that brought it to your attention. How and when did the book come to your attention?
Well, the book came to my attention in 2003. Yeah, in 2003. And I had just started, 2003. Yeah, 2003. So I was working on a film about global climate change, and we decided we didn't know how to tackle it, so we decided to tackle it by focusing on people who stayed up at night trying to figure out how to tackle it. I guess you could call them climate change messengers. And they were a very wide range of people, but none of them were really, and they're brilliant people, but and at the same time that we were doing that, we were sort of looking for examples of climate change in the United States that were clear and palpable. And so someone told me about this book, and when I read it, I realized it was so clear and it was so big and it was so palpable that we couldn't fit a one little piece of that story into our book. And I was sorry that we didn't. I really wanted to, but we didn't. And when that movie came out, it became really clear to me that as powerful as it might be in one way, it didn't actually speak to this story. It didn't speak to the real experience of what was happening in cities and the intersection of climate change and racism. And the thing that struck me by that book was I couldn't believe that one extreme weather event could reveal so much about our everyday life and our everyday systems, and what a disaster they really were. So and I couldn't believe when I read the book that I couldn't remember this at all. In 1995, I was in an editing room on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, working on a personal disaster movie about my own experience with cancer with the air conditioning on, and I didn't remember anything from that summer. So I couldn't believe I didn't remember it, and I couldn't believe what an extreme weather event could reveal.
It's interesting that you say you were working in 1995 and you had an air-conditioned room. And Cook certainly talks about people who were not privy to that as well.
So it's easy not to see when you're cool.
Right, right. Fenell, as a producer, you have an opportunity to look and choose different subjects to delve into. What was it about this one that drew you into it?
Excuse me. Well, Judith contacted me about this film, and I had known her work, but you know, the story really resonated with me as well. I actually did experience the 1995 heat wave firsthand. But, you know, somebody without air conditioning, but with lots of resources. I had a car that had air conditioning that I spent a lot of time in that weekend. I remember going to a grocery store in my neighborhood just for respite at one point and walking around in the very air-conditioned aisles. I went to lots of movie theaters. So anyway, you know, I really started to understand when Judith told me what she was doing, why this was such an important story. I wish I could say that I was worried about people on the other side of town during the heat wave, and I was ignorant to it until I started to see the trucks. But yeah, I mean, the story just really spoke to me, and I found it very important and compelling, and
To bring it to the screen
yes.
for us as well.
Yeah.
Thanks. Dr. Murray, as you listened to the audience share their words of how they felt upon seeing the film, did you have a word that you would add? Is there one?
The one that was in the film, Enraged. That's about it, which is a normal state.
Right.
And I think first I just want to have to say, having looked at the film again, that my favorite part of the film is all the footage you have on Dr. Whitman, on Steve. And see, he's certainly someone that we miss. But I think that there's something that perhaps wasn't said explicitly. You know, this is a movie that tried to say we have a slow-moving disaster, but the real problem on the South Side and West Side, the real problem with immigrant communities, is that it's an unnatural disaster. That is to say, it's a man-made disaster, and one of the reasons why people ignore it is because they don't think people are human. That's what racism is about. It's a hierarchy, a false hierarchy, but a hierarchy of human beings. And so you don't pay attention to people on the lower ranks. And I think the critical thing that things like the heat wave show you is that everyone on that ladder can be vulnerable at certain points in time. And we fail to take care of each other at our own folly.
Thank you. It's very true. It's about being neighbor to neighbor and really connecting with one another. Sometimes that's missing. Oftentimes it's missing. For you, Orrin, what word comes to your mind or would come to your mind?
Repetition. And how nothing's really changed. But also what resonates with me as well is all the folks, the Dr. Murrays, but also a lot of people live in the community that have the knowledge that could be utilized to solve a lot of these problems, not just in terms of people in the community, but also just in terms of general population. And how virtually every discipline you think about can be and must be utilized to resolve and solve the problems that we have. But also for me, taking a global perspective, and I guess some of that has to do with being in the military and being in a place for a couple of years like Thailand, and understanding that you can multiply this by several billion people. And so, you know, we have leadership and potential in terms of intellect that exists throughout that world, you know, starting in places like Inglewood, and then the new docs that are coming along that we work with at UIC, some of the young docs that work come out of the community to work at the University of Chicago. We know architects, we know building scientists, we know we could do a lot in terms of mitigating a lot of things that go on.
Thank you. I first would like to ask, what can we do? How can we become change makers as a result of really getting information like this and understanding the problems that are going on, not only in regard to the heat, because the heat is just part of the story. The real story is about poverty and racism that exists in our culture. How can we really be change makers?
Well, poverty and racism don't just exist by themselves, they're created. So some people are damaged by them, and some people benefit from them. So that's the first thing. But I think one of the exercises that I would encourage people to do is to try to ask questions about what you see on the news. So on the news, we've seen a lot of children in prisons, and what comes to my mind immediately is repetition. And I'm so glad that members of the Japanese community and the Jewish community have stood up and said this attitude of turning away immigrants, of turning away refugees, even though it means their death, is something that's happened before in our communities, and making that connection. I hope that when black people see the people fleeing countries of terror and violence caused by our government, that they'll remember people left the South not just to improve themselves. They were fleeing terrorism, fleeing lynching and beating and racism. So these dots have to be connected. And when we connect those dots, I think it becomes easier for people to say how we can solve these problems. So if I see someone from Chicago who's of Irish descent, whose grandparent or great-grandparent very probably came without documents, I'm just saying, then I hope there's a light bulb that goes off there and says, how do we take that experience of how the Irish were treated when they came in this city, and where they couldn't go, and where they couldn't work, and where they weren't welcomed, and understand that that same thing is being repeated on our southern border, not just with people from Latin America, though they're the most impacted, but also people from Africa and other places in the world now coming through Mexico and trying to go up in the border. And so what this means is the problem is not simply that Honduras has gangs. The problem is what created those gangs and that violence in Honduras, and who's making money off of what's going on in Honduras. So the problem is not Inglewood. Inglewood is not the problem. The problem is, how do we allow a small fraction of people to benefit greatly from capitalism and creating poverty? And those of us who pretend we're middle class, we get a few of those crumbs, okay? We get a few of those crumbs unless there's a recession, right? So we have to really open up our eyes and make the connections that we see, not only with each other, but also with historical precedents, so that we have a real understanding. It shouldn't be a surprise that these man-made deliberate disasters, man-made deliberate exploitations are going on and continue to go on.
I'm very happy. I'm very happy that you stressed man-made, because in the film, I believe it was you, Orrin, who talked about the steel workers no longer being around. It's Dr. Murray. About steel workers no longer being next door neighbors, because they certainly were my next door neighbors. My father worked in the meat packing industry, which was very big, and they certainly had a big presence in that Bridgeport area. Those jobs all no longer are around. They once employed many of the African Americans who came north from the South during the various waves of the migration, and how that affected those communities in terms of no longer having the same type of incomes coming into households. And even then, those incomes were sometimes two people who were putting in the time, as well as maybe another job. I'm going to open it up to those of you who are here. The person who says systemic, would you like to elaborate a little bit more? because I still have the words in my head. I don't remember the face. I remember the words. Okay.
They're bringing you a mic.
Yeah, I think it's a word that people looking at this sort of a problem from many perspectives can feel comfortable with. Some people think that it's an important word because, as Orrin mentioned, this extends far beyond our own community here. This is global. And others, I think, feel that this word gives them some personal distance from being culpable. That many people are able to look at situations and say, it's simply not possible for a minority of us to take action and make a change that will have a meaningful impact, that can change something that's spread around the globe. But others recognize that if this is affecting me, this is affecting everybody, and so then there really is no other option. That when there's a systemic issue like this, it's up to everybody, and that doesn't mean saying, if you figure out a solution, I'm right there behind you. That means I'm going to be right next to you.
Goes back to connecting the dots too. I mean, the dots are not only limited to one group, but it does show how we are all part of that same picture that we're hoped to be as far as community. And the person who said bullshit. Yes.
It never changes.
Okay.
It never changes, ever. I mean, it's the same thing over and over again. Just it's like a huge cycle.
So it goes back to the same old story, right? Forever. But it doesn't have to be the same old story when we talk about really being change makers. We hope.
I don't think it's ever going to change. Unless we have nuclear holocaust, that would be nice.
Oh,
Well,
my.
that's just me. I don't know.
Still amounts to the BS of what's going on. Yes.
If there's one thing I wish the film had stressed a little more was, speaking of systemic, how much money the people who manufacture those refrigerated morgues and so on are making. These government programs, there are economic reasons for these things too. Lots of people are making a hell of a lot of money, not only the manufacturers, but their stockholders and investors and so on. Good night. I mean, this is a terrible. You know, I am aware, as anybody in this audience would be, about these organic gardens and the vegetable trucks and so on, which are nice things, and they make small improvements, and I'm all for them. But that's a drop in the bucket compared with the juggernaut we're up against. As the general said, if we can get the funding for these things, these other programs, fine. But you find it for me, and we'll be happy to do it. But as things are now, it's all after the disaster. And you have to prove that you haven't caused the disaster and so on. As long as we're set up that way, nothing much is going to change. I remember reading the Klinenberg book when it first came out, and it was in hardcover. I'm thinking it was one of the best pieces of sociology I'd read in years. I'm not a sociologist, but one of my close friends is one, a U of C PhD, and I wrote him about it. The one thing I remember too after 9/11 was when the public became so much more affectionately disposed toward first responders, a term that didn't become current until after 9/11. Klinenberg says at one point, you know, it's good to have people check on seniors in the neighborhood and so on, whether police or others like firefighters in a paramilitary organization with its macho culture will feel equipped to do this job, or whether they'll feel demeaned by being asked to be social workers. It's hard to say. That those attitudes seem to have changed among first responders, and that's a good thing. Otherwise, it's a wonderful film, but you know, like this gentleman, I'm not encouraged. I knew about redlining when I was in law school, and that's 55 years ago. You know, we don't know about the Roosevelt era and so on. That map, no surprises. Everybody here is aware of this. But what happens? You know, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit angry, but I'm also not, as enthusiastic about a 20-something who says, I'm going to practice neighborhood law and not go into a big firm. I'm an old man now. There isn't much I can do about it. Enough out of me. Thank you, so.
It kind of just to be clear, I was an African studies major, right? So I used to learn all this stuff about Egypt and West African culture and all this stuff, right? And so you start feeling good about yourself, right? Yeah. But then one day I had to ask the question, so now that I feel good about myself, now what? And so what also became clear to me is that what's missing in terms of folks that look like me and other folks is that since the slave trades and the colonial periods and all this stuff, we've not been allowed to do what we have been doing for 200, 300,000 years, and that's determine how communities exist, how we take care of ourselves, where water comes from, what we eat, how we shelter ourselves, and none of that. So this is really a process of decolonization, if you will. But, for those folks who are sitting here who think that they ain't colonized because they look a certain way, back to Dr. Murray's point, y'all got another thing coming too. Because, tell me how, are you really self-determined? Really? Are you? Because you are subject to the same things I'm subject to, whether you want to believe it or not. And that's why everybody jumping them down about Trump and all this other stuff, right? So it's about whether we really going to be kinfolk. We can talk about being skinfolk, but we're going to be kinfolk. And are we going to recapture our pathway to how we live on this planet? You want to talk about, food. Those of us that deal with urban ag and community gardens and all that, we real quick nowadays to tell folks, that ain't what we really interested in. We don't even want to be identified as that because we're interested in housing. Right. We're interested in not just doctors and nurses, but all the things that contribute to wellness. We're interested in what makes community, whether it's micro, hyperlocal, or whether it's the next block, the next community, the next city, the state, the nation, the planet, whatever the case may be. We don't want to be pigeonholed anymore. We're real serious about we need to reorder, rethink, retool, do anything we need to do. I want to talk about funds. We got funds to deal with endless war. I'm in my 70s now. I remember the poster about, having the Pentagon do a bake sale for a fighter jet, right? So repetition, ain't nothing changed. You got money to upgrade the nuclear arsenal, spend $1 trillion on that.
So I want to address my two brothers here who have been trying to depress us.
Okay.
So, and I want to be clear because I think you said you were a lawyer. I don't know but I know this. You all were educated and trained in Western thought. And if you think logically, then we might as well just give up, which means they've accomplished what they wanted with the education. So now, and I agree with you, by the way, that one organic garden or one particular program, I think your criticism about interesting, innovative programs, I think that's bullshit. The question is, do we think we have to lose? That's really the question.
Okay.
Do you think that your grandchildren have to be in a worse shape than we are today? Because that's the way things are going. Now, if you ask me or any rational person, can we change this in 2020? For example, say with voting, which I always do. I'm going to say, no, you're crazy.
Right.
Okay? So I think we have to make a distinction between understanding that it's possible to win. We may not have what we need to win right now. Okay? We may not even be clear exactly how to win. But there's a big difference between saying it's impossible to win, because that leads you to the conclusion we'll always have poor people. Some people are always never going to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Or if you believe the way Trump does, black people are incapable of being rational. They're incapable of not being poor. I mean, that's part of this ideology. So when we see this, to me, it's built to make you seem like you could never change anything. Okay? It's like that one picture, I think it happened in China, where that one guy standing in front of the tank. Now, you know he's dead if the tank moves, right? So most rational people won't run out and stand in front of the tank. I think what we also should learn from history, though, is on those occasions where we imagine that it's possible for us to win, where you actually can think that maybe it's possible to abolish chattel slavery. Okay. Then sometimes you make a step forward, not where we need to be. Okay, you exchange chattel slavery for some other stuff, but that's a different discussion. So I would encourage us, and and like you, I'm old too, so my position now is I got nothing to lose. What I'm interested in are my great-grandchildren going to be able to live in a better world than what we've lived in.
Yeah, and I got 7 of those.
Yeah, so, but it means thinking differently. It means understanding whatever area you're working in, that voter suppression is a major structural problem. It means having an understanding of what are structural issues and what are other issues that we may work in because we're physicians or doctors or teachers or housing advocates or whatever. The structural issues we have to pay attention to. So when we suppress the vote, we compromise everything. I'm going to forget how many decades ago, when the Chicago public schools eliminate recess, intramural sports, music and other reading, but let's just deal with the activity. When they do that, as a physician, you have to say, we're going to have an outbreak of type 2 diabetes. When I was a young doctor, we had juvenile diabetes and adult diabetes. We never saw type 2 diabetes in a young person. It was never lectured about. We never saw it. Today, we have an epidemic of type 2 diabetes. It didn't happen just because Chicago public schools eliminated recess, but other things happened in terms of how we produce food, how we sweeten food. So these things are all connected. And our task is at least try to understand that web that's creating these problems. Because once you understand the web, or some piece of it, you can start deconstructing it. But please, in your last years, don't give up on us now, Go out fighting.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of...
That bumper sticker. Berkeley and the Aces, really nices. It'll be a great day in this country when education is abundantly funded and the Air Force have to hold a bake sale.
Right. Yeah, that's the one.
Right. That's the one.
Well, and also, like Dr. Murray said, dare to struggle, dare to win.
There was a hand there in the back. You gave up, sister?
There's a young woman.
It was me. Thank you. I realized that my heart is beating really fast. I found myself thinking I too was enraged. And in some of those last comments from like this side of the panel, I found my heart beating faster because I think as one of the younger people in the room, I know there were some like young kids, but as one of the younger people, I found myself saying like, please don't give up. Because as young voters, as young organizers, as young educators and young doctors, we truly do look to our elders and peers who are educating us, supposed to be mentoring us, supposed to be offering promotions and things like that. And if y'all have lost faith, it sets a tone. And unfortunately, it sets a tone of defeated something. And so there's a lot to be said about morale. And I think for those of us who are willing to see the systemic opportunities and don't see organic gardens as just one drop, but a part of a greater web of action, it's encouraging to recognize that it's action. And so I feel my heart flutters because I too feel the need for more, and I felt the enraged part, but I found my heart beating even faster when I said, like, please just don't give up, because there's a whole generation looking to so many of you all who have said this is repetitious. For everybody who has told me, I was there for the first Earth Day, and this is the same stuff we've been talking about, bringing down carbon emissions, and the fact that the maps of Chicago have been the same for generations, plural. There's real action that needs to happen. And so for somebody with a sociologist friend, with a PhD at UIC, and all the lawyers, and I'm sure there are plenty of degrees in this room, use that power to say, we're tired of it, because the people living in it and directly affected by it are tired of it too, and we're tired of you not, to the gentleman 2 seats in front, not being side by side and using your privilege in ways to really make things different.
Thank you.
We've been listening. We've been listening, and I mean, you know what? I love what you said about not thinking rationally. It's important not to be rational and to sort of think out of the box and think hopeful. So I know I might have come off kind of naive, and I ask a lot of naive questions, and I asked questions of Dr. Murray that drove her crazy, especially the disaster paradigm. She hated it. But we do say throughout, man-made disaster, man-made disaster. But I think that if man created it, just like you said, we can turn it around. And I think we have a great opportunity just here in the city with this new mayor and a new administration that seems incredibly willing and open to do some real reform. So, I'm interested in words. We were trying to ask a lot of definitions in here. Just a couple of weeks ago, the county of Milwaukee decided to make a declaration and a resolution that racism was a public health crisis. And they changed the language because it seems to me like they know, to some extent, I guess it's because they know how, they think they know, or they're committed. They think if they call it a public health crisis, then they'll be much, much more committed to actually addressing it. So, I think that's, I've never seen that before. Now, it could just be words, but on the same time, words shape laws, and words rewrite laws. So there's no reason why the point at which we use an infrastructure or a whole bunch of that money to buy a new truck, we can't invest in a community and invest in the way that the community really needs for it to be much more vibrant and much more prepared for everyday life, let alone for a future disaster. So I think that that's possible. I think, so, it'll be very interesting to see what happens in Milwaukee. It'll be interesting to see if the new mayor, if everyone said, hey, declare, structural racism a public health crisis, and let's attack it in the same way that we do other crises. Would that be useful?
Well, what I was thinking of when you were talking about is Reverend Barber, and he talks about how we need a third Reconstruction. And so history, the negative portions of history, the oppressive parts of history, do repeat themselves, but also struggle repeats itself. And what Reverend Barber means when he talks about the third Reconstruction is, he argues the first Reconstruction that happened after Civil War and the emancipation, the end of chattel slavery. Go back and read Du Bois's book on Black Reconstruction and see what things were put in place after the end of slavery to address the structural conditions. And one of the most important demands of the emancipated slaves was free public education. Yes. That still exists. Now, we don't all have equal education, but the concept of free public education is encased in the structure of America today, in large part because of the struggle of those emancipated slaves. And then we see how the forces of reaction undermine that embryonic reconstruction, and how they then put different kinds of things in place at a structural level to reverse that. And then Barbara argues that in some ways the relatively modern civil rights movement, I think he skipped one there, but we won't quibble over it, might be considered the second Reconstruction, certainly maybe from World War I through the Voting Rights Act. But that we've seen, though you see it on the evening news every night, I'm not sure we have time to reflect on it, how the right wing has undermined that Reconstruction. It's not an accident that they took over the judiciary. They sat and planned and said, let's do it this way, let's do it that way. So we need to pay attention to that. And so he's arguing that we've had Reconstruction periods before in this country, and now we need a third Reconstruction, but it needs to go beyond just this country. It needs to go beyond how we treat our indigenous people. It needs to look at the rest of the hemisphere. Why does the United States, that always used to bother me in school, why do they get to determine everything in the Western Hemisphere? You know, I mean, I know they're white people, but I mean, why other than that? So, because if we address that, then we would have a different immigration policy in this country, and we would be able to solve our immigration problems. So what I would say is, if the right wing and racist power structure dedicated to capitalism and maximizing profits, if they can plan and address the structural conditions of society, when we come together, when we unite our forces, we can do that. We've done it before, and we can do it again. And when we fail, it's not just because we gave up. It's because the enemy was stronger at that point in history. So I will say this to the young person, and I'm going to shut up. My granddaughters are all, I guess a couple of them are over 20 now, but anyway, they're 17 to 21, 22 years old. And as most adolescents, when they were growing up, they used to have fights, and still do, with their parents, you know, and they would leave the house. And they would come to me, and I'd be saying, well, you know, you have to listen to your parents, and they really love you, and it's not really horrible that they want you to clean up your room. There are worse things in the world, you know, normal. And they would say, oh, no, they're horrible. They don't know anything. I said, well, you talk to me, and, you know, I'm agreeing with your parents. You talk to me. And this was a big moment that I understood as a grandparent. They said, Linda, you know you don't know anything. You know you're out of it. Our parents haven't figured it out yet. And that's really how I feel where we are. I have no clue what your generation is going to do, okay? I only know what happened in my lifetime. I try to pass that knowledge on. And I know we operate in different worlds, but we happen to accidentally be in the same physical space right now. And so we have to work together and communicate with each other. Half the stuff the young people want to do, I had no clue. But I remember when I was young, the older people had no clue what we were doing either. So we have to remember these things are not exactly the same. It doesn't mean we're always making progress. I don't believe in history always goes forward. Oftentimes we get pushed back. But we have to do something. Otherwise, you might as well die. You know, if you're not willing to stand up and fight, then you're basically giving up and you're dying. So to me, those are the only two choices that I see, and I choose to stand up and fight.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, again, I think about some of the stuff I've always heard from family and different folks of African descent about, and the story sort of goes like this. Oh, I was building a house, or we had Black Wall Street, or we had whatever, right? And you can't do that, right? You can't build a house nicer than me. You know, you can't have a horse better than mine. Your crops can't be better than mine. But that's some stuff we really also need to come to terms with. And how folks want to uphold that. And not most of us want to uphold that, but that right wing or that edge to that want to uphold this notion of race and white supremacy, that's one of the things we don't want to talk about and come to terms with. Because if we want to really acknowledge, hey, you made a mistake, right? You know, the climate change and colonialism, slavery, human trafficking, I mean, all this stuff, right? You know, it's a mistake, but you don't want to own up to it because then that undermines your notion of superiority, right? You gotta have Inglewood. You gotta have a ghetto, right? Because we got rid of the water fountains that were different, but you still gotta maintain that visual, or that, what did Trump say? One of the things and I don't even talk about that and don't pay much into him. One thing that stuck out to me was, what was his attorney's name? Michael Cohen. And they were coming from the airport in Chicago. They come through the hood and say, yeah, see, they like to live like that, right? So people like him want to imagine that that's true so that he can uphold, in his twisted mind, some notion of his own superiority. And, you know, we really got to come to terms with that. So when you look at the stuff you saw in that film, and I think Judith and I first ones to talk about it, that aesthetic of oppression, right? That abandonment, that boarded up, that block I grew up on, no houses left, you know, that is like, oh my God, see, we're superior. We don't do that. They like living like that, which is the biggest lie you can ever imagine. People do not like that, but it's important in terms of maintaining that man-made racial hierarchy and caste, right? And you see it everywhere on the planet, not just black folk, white folks, but, you know, you go to India where the Dalits live, or, you know, you go to certain parts of countries like Thailand, you know, and they use umbrellas, so they want people to think they're rural, because if you get in the sun, you know, your skin is going to get dark. So, you know, we really got to come to terms with this caste system.
One thing I'd like to add to what our panelists have said is when we think about today, we hear the word disrupt often in terms of disrupting different industries such as taxis, hotel industries. What really occurs to me as I think about the film and everything the panelists have said so far, and from you, is we need to really think about disrupting our thinking, disrupting our minds. Think about how many times we turn on our computers and what do we see? We see ads, one thing after another, something to sell us something to show some way that we need something. If we start to think about disruption in the way of our thinking, in terms of how we can change our thinking, what can we do? How can we be change makers in our society and our culture so that we can really serve ourselves and be in community for one another? I think we're about to wrap things up, but I wanted to get to two more people who had mentioned their words. One was injustice. Would that person talk about injustice and elaborate that on a little bit more?
Yeah, to me that was just so glaring, and it goes with everything else that was said. That it's just, if you have a sense of justice and you see this, it's just glaring injustice to let an entire population just, you know, be in that environment and not. It was just what really hit me in the movie was that we're willing to address that disaster for the moment, the 3 days of heat, but we're totally blind to the man-made disaster, and we were completely comfortable with that. We will marshal armies to take care of 3 days of heavy rain, but 30 years of not giving people what, you know, one part of town what the other part takes for granted. And it's just mind-boggling, and it's injustice. That's the only thing I can think of.
Thank you. Thank you. And also, the same old story, if you would elaborate on that a little bit more in terms of the same old American story. Get him the mic. Here he comes.
Well, you know, I think that sort of says it, and Dr. Murray said it about, I mean, the roots that started with slavery and the undermining of Reconstruction, which barely got started before it was undermined. But I wanted to mention something very small, but that's kind of hopeful, that has to do with our, actually it has to do with the new assessor. In Chicago, we have had a tradition of over-assessing. People in the very neighborhoods, the very maps that we're looking at, were paying more for their houses than the people on the north side in taxes. And the new guy came in and he changed that. And I never write a letter to a reporter, but this is what we need to connect the dots. She did a story about white people on the north side saying, my taxes have gone up, my property has gone up 60%. That was the whole story. She never showed the other side of the story. She never showed what's happening in those neighborhoods, that for once it's fairer than it used to be. Nobody's making up for all the many, many decades that they were being overassessed and paying more, but at least it's fairer now. And all we saw was people complaining. So I wrote her. She actually wrote back and said, yeah, I'm going to deal with that later.
I think on that note, as we wrap up, we're not giving up on the reframe and the language. And we have, in that spirit, created postcards to the new mayor of Chicago, Mayor Lightfoot, asking for her to declare racism a public health issue. Crisis, sorry. We also, and I think, you know, in the film, Dr. Whitman talks about the 16-year lifespan differential. The bad news is today in 2019, that's now 30 years across the city of Chicago. So we've created these postcards that basically just, you know, say, this is my zip code, and based on that, and we can fill out that part, you don't have to. This is how long I will live, and we would like you to address this in these ways, and then sign your name at the bottom. Those are outside the door. If you're willing to fill one out, we will mail those to the mayor.
You know, we don't think it will make a change overnight, but we think actually it's pretty interesting, and it could be incredibly useful. And then you guys could have a real good meeting with her.
Oh, that would be a good meeting.
We're working on it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, you know what?
One more.
Before everybody leaves, we got so involved in here that we forgot to recognize three special guests that are in the audience. So one is Andy Nebel, who you saw. He was the young reporter who got choked up on screen. Could you just stand up so everyone could see you? Thank you for being here. Did Valerie leave? Okay. And the other one was Valerie Brown, who unfortunately... She just left. Okay. And so she was the granddaughter of Mrs. Washington. And thank you. And Ken, stand up. So Ken Herzlich, and the stringer, who is still doing that work every single night. And thank you so much for your participation and your footage and your support. Okay.
Thank you.
And thank you, all of you.
Thank you for coming.